So interesting. We've been doing starting the process of U.S. history curriculum revisions, and I put out a question on my Facebook to my colleagues of color, educators of color across the nation that I've been privileged to connect with. Is what is the essential history that is not taught that you believe needs to be taught? And I ended up getting an interesting response from a former student who's white, who commented the untold story of the Arab slave trade. And this isn't the first time I've seen this type of thing pop up. It's a common kind of white fragility response to the conversation about telling untold stories, and it belies like several assumptions, and so not just with the person who said this, but I think in general this is a common retort of kind of like conservative white thought, is that we don't do enough to cover other people's oppression. We only focus on the oppression that was enacted by white Europeans. And part of this is, I think, a pushback and a feeling of disequilibrium, because history, the way history is taught, is no longer dominated by a solely white perspective, a Eurocentric perspective. It still has a pretty good stronghold on the way history is taught in our country, but there's definitely a shift. And so as the shift happens, you're going to see this response, because it's a challenge to the white dominant narrative. And so people are going to push back of like, you need, if you're going to focus on this, you need to focus on other things. And you really get into a lot of whataboutism. And so because of the focus on the Atlantic slave trade, a lot of times people will feel like it's unfairly characterizing slavery as only existing by Americans, right, during that time period. And so first off, the Arabic slave trade, and sometimes it's kind of mislabeled the Islamic slave trade, but it pre-existed Islam and continued through Islam. But the Arabic slave trade is talked about, but it's talked about in world history because it's not U.S. history. It just isn't. It doesn't take place on U.S. soil. Yes, slaves that were imported, some of them were purchased from Arabic traders. Some of them were purchased by African traders, right? And so that conversation can be had there, but it's not specifically U.S. history. And throughout history, AP World History or Core World History, I think there are conversations about the role slavery plays. I tell my students all the time that slavery has existed as long as human society has existed. But this distraction by saying, well, what about these other types of slavery, ignores the type of slavery that happened with the transatlantic slave trade, where you really got to a point where slavery was based off race, and the legal definition and codification of race. And it also is one of the only types of slavery, wholesale slavery, where it was hereditary and people were born into slavery for generations. And it also was particularly violent and had no rights for slaves. Most slave systems have some type of right where people can purchase their own freedom, or that there's a limit on how long that they can be enslaved or whatever it may be, or at least has guidelines for the benevolent treatment of slaves. But we don't see that with American slavery and with the Atlantic slave trade specifically. And it's not that those things didn't happen in other places. Slaves were mistreated and harmed, and in some cases their slavery was hereditary. But as a whole system, the Atlantic slave trade was, it was different. It was a new form of slavery. And so I think when people bring that up, that argument about what about other types of slavery, because the Arabic slave trade from, the 1700s to 2000s enslaved about 1 million Southern Europeans. And people are like, well, why don't they talk about that? Why people were enslaved too? And, when we talk about impact of history, the Atlantic slave trade had a much larger impact on the modern day than these other types of slavery did, particularly with U.S. history. And so, I think we have to factor that in. I think we have to factor in the systems that were created post-slavery to prevent newly emancipated enslaved peoples from gaining access in society and gaining power and gaining voice. And so, But ultimately, I really do believe that this is just a response of I don't want to be made out to be the bad guy. I feel like you're making me out to be the bad guy. So what about these other bad guys? And it's a defense mechanism. It's a tactic to not have to deal with the real and true history of the United States and of white people. And so I encourage people, to get past that and to learn. You want to explore other types of slavery, that's fine. But in a U.S. history class, the untold story, there is no untold story of the Arabic slave trade in U.S. history. And there is a lot of untold stories when it comes to the enslavement of Africans in the United States. And so, just been on my mind. It's popped up like 3 times over the last month. And so I just thought it was interesting that people, get hung up on that so much and want to shift the blame. I also think it's connected to Islamophobia and the desire to paint Muslims as being specifically evil or more inherently evil than any other group. And that's hogwash as well. So anyway, we'll see you tomorrow.